there. So you spoke to your actuarial journey, right? And you said that you studied at Wits, and you then did write your fellowship in general insurance. But can you speak to some of the struggles you had? Like, did you ever, like, at a point in time say like, okay, this is not for me? I mean, you said in second year you were kind of like, what's this all about? But like, yeah, can you just unpack that? Because I think, that's the element of actuarial science I don't think we speak enough about. Once we qualify, it's like, yeah, no, just breezy. But it actually is not.
Yeah, I think you're never not struggling until you qualify. It feels like, it's quite a push. I did a talk at UCT last year to their honors class about what it's like studying while you work, because that was one of the big challenge areas for me. And then the other challenge was studying while I was actually university studying. So yeah, studying is difficult. I think I'll start with the work one first. So when you shift, and my first year of work was a disaster in terms of studying, because when you shift to work, you suddenly have a lot of new responsibilities and short deadlines and pressures that you didn't have in university because there was alignment, right? You were studying. Yeah,
that's what that was your job. All the tests were put into the calendar and checked that it wasn't too on top of each other or whatever, which is not the case when it comes to work.
Yeah, because now you have client deadlines or year ends or different things happening at the same time that exams are happening, and learning to prioritize. And as I think Steve's also been on this, would say your job in your first few years is to qualify.
Yes.
So it took me a while to...
It's so important. So important. I don't think that can actually be emphasized enough. I say to my students, they're like, should I take like a gap out of studying, etc.? And I'm like, your priority is to qualify, and you never regret qualifying. I mean, can you resonate with that?
No, like once it's done, it's done. That weight lifts. It's a massive... You don't even know what to do with all the free time. It's a massive shift.
It's just how other people live. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, so continue.
Not at all. So I think the big challenge I had there was I couldn't really prioritize studying or work, and it wasn't work's fault. Like it's up to you to manage that. So I got a bit better on like actively managing. This is a very cool project. I definitely want to be on it, but it's also in the middle of my exams, and making the choice. Sometimes it was worth choosing the project because the experience I got from that helped a lot. Other times it was worth going, actually I need to focus on the exams. Let me not put my hand up for this. Creating a routine, I'm not a very routine person, and university kind of gives that to you, right? Every day you have a timetable, you have tides, you kind of forced to, regular check-ins with your tests along the way. Creating that while I was working was a bit difficult, and what worked for me, and different people did different ways, but every morning from 7 to 9 I studied. I got to work early, studied, and then after that I worked. Because I'd find when I studied in the evening I was quite tired. Other people do it the other way around. I think the message is create a focused time for studying.
And carve that out of your schedule. Don't be like, I'll do it when there is time, because
there will never be time yet.
Especially in consultancy, I feel. Because there's always more that you can sort of fill in.
Always.
And speaking to sort of like broadly, like over your whole career now, what have been some of the projects that have really stood out for you from like an interest perspective, or maybe even projects that you didn't think that you would be able to work on as an actuary, because I think we've sometimes quite siloed views, especially as young actuaries, as to what we can work on, and to maybe speak to some of the things that you've worked on and found so interesting, obviously within confidentiality and what you're allowed to share.
So I think I can get away for the EY ones. I can talk about the projects, but I won't mention the specific clients. For the Investec ones, I'll have to think a bit harder.
That's okay. Share what you went into.
Okay. So most of the projects I've really enjoyed have been ones that have used actuarial tools, but in a different context. So it wasn't an insurance context. One that we did was to evaluate, and it's quite topical for SA, we're looking at the feasibility of NHI for an African country, not SA. And the learnings in that, and speaking to doctors and hospital groups and trying to understand, that was quite interesting. That's kind of that is within the actual space. Then we did another one that extended the ideas in there a bit, where we looked at the purchase of a hospital group by private equity fund. And again, that was quite interesting, because it's like, this is again like, I understand that the technical things we're doing, but the context is quite cool. And the technical stuff, you had to stretch it a bit, because this wasn't, data that fits into what you had learned about. You had to adjust for that.
Also, what was really interesting about that project for me, I mean, I was obviously a sort of behind you from a qualifying perspective and entering the workplace, but was also understanding stakeholders and what they needed from you, and how that also informed how you present things. I think that was one of the first projects where I was like, oh wow, like understanding stakeholders is so important, because you need to understand what they are asking you for, so that you answer the questions that they're asking.
Yeah, and often pitching what you are, your conclusions at an appropriate level is key because some people need the technical detail. They need to fully understand the methods of what you're doing. Other people need the conclusion and to just understand the risks.
Yes.
And knowing where to pitch stuff so that the stakeholders get what they need at the appropriate level is often,
very
quite tricky.
Yeah.
But a very important actuarial skill. That communication skill is key. I think we touched on it about bridging that gap between technical, what's possible, and business, what's, feasible, commercial, required, what they need to understand.
Yeah.
This is quite important.
Yeah. And any other projects you're willing to touch on?
So a couple cool ones. So projects are interesting because sometimes they're interesting technically because you're doing something new for the first time. Other times they're interesting just because it's a high profile, very
like once in a lifetime
thing to work on. Once in a lifetime. Yeah. So there are a couple that bridge those gaps. So one was looking at silicosis liability. So we didn't do the original calculation, and this is again something
we also worked together. Yeah. Did you just call me Margaret?
I said Margaret for your podcast. Yeah. So we had to review a model another actuary had built, someone quite senior, that looked at the liability that mines would owe their workers as a result of silicosis claims. And there were all actuarial techniques in there. It was mortality rates, morbidity, survival curves, discounting to get, evaluating uncertainty in these claims. And this was the first time that I saw it done in kind of a very large sort of cohort-based model where, this liability stretches back to how old are the oldest miners, to current, emerging claims that will only emerge in 20, 30, 40 years' time. So very large scale of time, lots of assumptions to test, lots of technical stuff to work through, and also quite tight time deadlines and lots of security around it. We could only work on one laptop stored at a client, so we took shifts to work around the clock.
What about that? I think also what was so interesting about that project for me was that, like, obviously we were valuing the liability that they had towards these miners, but then also realizing that the liability is actually smaller in some cases than we thought it would be because they couldn't get hold of the miners.
Yeah.
And there was that aspect of like the environment that comes in also again from your honors sort of content where you're like, oh, actually like our work is directly impacted by these other factors, which is not actuarial. Like being able to contact someone is not strictly actuarial. And then you realize like all these dynamics that come into play in our work, which was it was a very interesting project. I actually forgot about that. Goodness, I do remember us taking shifts in that little room. Do you remember?
Yes.
And it was like a glass room and like everyone in the business could watch us work. It was like such a weird experience. It was so odd. Oh my word.
And the one laptop with the model on it.
Yes, exactly.
Separate.
Oh, just goodness. There was something else. There was something else. And have you found that in moving to banking, the projects are very different? I mean, obviously you talked about, I'm not asking you to talk about the projects, but that you have an internal client. And so obviously everything is sort of focused on the banking mechanism, I would assume. Whereas when you were in the consulting space, it was very much what the client wants. So it could vary sort of widely. Or if you found that spectrum sort of within the banking space as well.
Yeah, so within the banking group, there's still a pretty broad spectrum. Obviously not as broad as consulting.
Yeah.
Everything is in the banking context, although there is a life insurer in the group and there's an investment arm as well. But it's within that context, whereas most of the insurance work was within an insurance context, but there were also these unusual projects just as a result of EY being, a large Big Four consultancy. When things came into the business, like another example is a country needed to evaluate the cost of road accidents to the economy.
Sure.
And that's quite an interesting one because what they were looking at is like, if we have one of the highest accident rates in the world, if we spend more on our roads or policing or change, laws around speed limits, what impacts could that have? So that, that's took a lot of work from us, from economics teams, from a team that's involved in strategy, compliance and stuff, all came together to make that project feasible. But being able to work with everyone there, that's, not necessarily something you get if you are just at a corporate, because just the nature of work that comes to a consultancy versus, that occurs in a corporate is different.
Yeah. And I think, what would you say, having now worked in different spaces, I mean, you have quite a wide view, is the benefit of being an actuary over, let's say, a quant or someone who's just studied economics? Or like, so what would you say, like, do you regret becoming an actuary? Do you think that a different path would have been more helpful for you? Or what do you think is sort of like, what sets us apart as actuaries in your experience or in your view?
So I think there's maybe, it's off the top of my head, maybe three things that are key differentiators. So one is the technical expertise. And the first thing people would say to me is, oh, but quants also study.
Yeah, especially what I was going to say.
So this is maybe a bit of it's an interesting one because of the hurdle of the exams.
Yeah.
There's a sort of natural filter. If someone gets through to be an actuary, there's an appreciation that you've jumped through a lot of hoops to get there.
Yeah.
There's a belief that you really do know your stuff.
Yeah.
So that reputation helps because immediately people take what you say with maybe a bit more trust, but you also you have proved you actually have the skills.
Yeah.
And the skill set that we have, I think it's one thing to know how to discount cash flows. It's another to know how to do that and understand risks and probabilities and understand this and understand context and apply survival, and kind of bringing all those together is quite a unique skill set. So that's the one thing, that the technical expertise and the reputation. The other, I think, is the communication skills. So we've touched on this before, but often when I speak to quants who are taking me through models, I'll be in the room with other stakeholders, and the technical people are comfortable following along, and the business people are going like, what on earth does this mean? Like, so what? Like, what does this, And I think I found in my experience, actuaries are a bit better at bridging that gap where, like we said, you can appropriately say enough technical, give enough of the technical work for people to understand and have comfort and understand where the risk lies, but also not go into too much detail that they get lost.
Yeah.
And very important, you can explain the consequences, the so what of this.
Yeah.
So I think that's another one. Yeah, I think the first covered.
Yes. I think so. It was quite interesting. I think in talking to numerous people through doing this podcast, I sort of almost re-looked at my idea of an actuary. And I think an actuary in many ways is a generalist. Like, you have the technical base, you have the business base, you have the communication base. And so you can almost like level up in whatever space you need to. And I never actually thought about it that way. I just thought about, like, we understand risk really well and risks are everywhere, therefore we have a role. But it's actually so much more than that. And it's interesting how many people have emphasized the communication. Whereas communication is something that I think a lot of people are like, oh, this is a subject we just have to do, but we hate it, And actually how important that is in the workplace. Because if you can't communicate what you're doing, why should people trust what you've done?
Yeah, I think if you were only working in a small room with other actuaries surrounding you, communication's still important there.
Yeah.
But everyone has the same background and context, so it's a lot easier.
Yeah.
When you go into corporate and there's different backgrounds and contexts and different needs, you have to adjust how you communicate for people to understand and get value out of what you've done.
Yeah.
There's no point in doing all the work if no one can understand what it means for them.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. So I think one of the last things I would ask you is, to our audience, especially our audience who are considering studying actuarial science or who are in that journey, what is some encouragement you would give to them? Because I know that, and we've spoken to this, there's a lot of discouragement that we feel along the way. And I think to get encouragement from someone who is a couple of steps in front of you can sometimes be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I think it's worth it. I have no regrets. The many failed attempts at exams and long hours studying, and I do think it's worth it. And I also think it's enjoyable along the way. People maybe underestimate that you're getting to do technical, difficult things, and there is an enjoyment in, solving problems that are hard for the first time. So I think if you have the dedication to do it, you definitely can get through. Spend more time studying rather than study not enough and write the exam again. And it's a matter of time that you put in and effort. And I think everyone who gets into the AXI course has the potential to go ahead and qualify. And I think it is worth walking the journey. I do really enjoy what I do now. Didn't speak much about it, but I really
I think like, as you say, I think it's also an interesting thing to touch on, in that sometimes you do work on very confidential products and projects. I remember at EY when we would work on confidential projects, and they get all these weird names. Do you remember that? And that's also quite cool, like, because that you are almost like on the cutting edge, right? And without speaking to your projects in particular, just talk more widely, like, what are some of like the wider fields for actuaries? Like, there's obviously those core disciplines where, that's what you write your fellowship in. But where are some of sort of like the other non-traditional spaces that you've seen that actuaries are kind of inputting into or growing into?
Yes, I can talk to the one that my team kind of borders, which is data science, machine learning. And often what we find is the key issue is explainability of these models. So someone does something and we need to kind of unpack the black box to understand, okay, why is it doing this way? How does it compare to a traditional model?
Yeah.